Hi, and welcome to this live reading from Leela's Choice by Jennifer Rains, and this is presented by Itsy Bitsy Book Bits. Chapter 1. Hamish McGregor gave a silent whistle. The images he'd seen of Carmen Vella hadn't done her justice. Professional websites, her niece's social feed. Carmen was often in the background. Good enough for recognition, although the unskilled snap and upload photography was exposed the moment Hamish spotted the flesh and blood woman through the customs gate at Lucca, Malta International Airport. Her hair matched the Instapics, thick and blue-black, while the Gaiman cut framed distinctive facial features. Her sculpted cheekbones were balanced by a softly rounded chin, a slightly too wide mouth, and a straight nose. From close study, he knew her eyes were ebony, not black. His subtle browns and greens had held his attention longer than strictly necessary for identification purposes. Every single image had missed the energy emanating in waves from the woman walking towards him. He'd want her passion on his side in a fight. Maybe that explained why her father had dispatched her from Australia rather than come himself. She was also gorgeous. Impossible to ignore. Her purposeful stride emphasized the vitality contained in her compact body. Her skin tone was a warm olive, a reminder of her family's Mediterranean origins. She wore a loose tomato red sweater and a tailored straight dark trousers atop short leather boots. The sense of lush curves had him sucking in a breath. The air around her snapped with electricity. Ms. Carmen Vella was making a dramatic entrance, if you equated drama with stealing one's breath. Her head lifted to scan her surroundings, and her rich, dark gaze collided with his. Desire was immediate, the kind he hadn't experienced since he was an adolescent, when hormones regularly swamped more cerebral considerations. Any considerations, if I'm honest. His reaction rocked him. Mindless lust was a relic of his adolescence, along with his drum kit. He valued women, loved his mother and sisters, and respected the women who worked for him. It took more than an attractive package to trigger his libido. Why Carmen Vella? The kicker was the secrets clouding her eyes in those images he'd studied. They'd stuck in his mind. He'd understood defenselessness. His success as a domestic violence and child protection advocate depended on it. This woman wasn't defenseless, but the disconnect between the vulnerability in her eyes and the photos and the self-possession in every line of the elegant Miss Vella tugged at him. She cleared the final exit, her journey from Sydney, Australia to Valletta, Malta, complete. Carmen Vella? He closed the last few meters between them. Her head turned, her body stilled, her expression unreadable. You work for my father. Question or accusation? He held his palms up in a gesture of goodwill. I work for myself. I was in Malta on other business, but I've agreed to stay a few days longer to assist you in your family search for your niece. I haven't asked for your assistance. Her voice was deep and low, the soft cadence at odds with the weariness he read in her stare. He hadn't expected suspicion. Your father, he started. I'm here, independently of my father. She placed careful emphasis on each word. Ms. Vella. Only my father calls me Carmen. Miranda, we're blocking the exit. There was a time when saying Carmen instantly sparked the response Miranda, at least in his house where his grandfather had been hooked on old movies. Let's get out of everyone's way. He raised his voice enough to explain to a casual onlooker why he'd reached for her suitcase. Miranda! She held tightly to her bag. Her scent, a little peppery, was proving a more reliable clue to the woman than the short bio he'd uncovered in his limited research. Seriously? Carmen Miranda, a 1940s Hollywood star? What century are you from? Give me an alternative. Who are you? She demanded. He was close enough to be singed by the sparks flying off her. Hamish McGregor. I'm an Australian lawyer specializing in the illegal movement of minors across international borders. He extracted his passport from his jacket pocket and passed it to her. As I said, I'm in Malta on other business and agreed to provide some assistance. To Papa? She scanned his passport, a slight tremble in her hand. Aren't you both pursuing the same objective? I'm not sure of his objective. Hamish was also close enough to glimpse the wariness he'd missed at first glance. The turbulence in her beautiful eyes testified to an eternal battle. He was impressed with the self-control trumped tiredness and anxiety about her missing niece. Sorry, I wasn't expecting Papa to contact me so soon. But you were expecting contact. Hamish's instructions from Sydney had been explicit. Giovanni Vella is my father. I love him. We share a big house with my niece and Papa's sister. There's always contact. She dimpled through her exhaustion, her smile devastating in its charm. Her response was a succinct summary, but not quite the truth. Giovanni Vella might be the devil or a saint for all the inflection in her voice, and Hamish was no clearer on whether she'd cooperated his search. Tell me what Papa's asked you to do. Apart from working with you? He asked. A frown marred her smooth brow, giving Hamish a clue. You really weren't expecting me here. Now. Not so soon, but here you are. How about I buy you coffee? Talk about what we each expected. Hamish bent all the assumptions he'd made so far. She nodded. He took charge of her suitcase and headed out of the stream of people towards the nearby cafe. The rat-tat-tat of her heels hitting the marble tiles of the concourse close behind beat out a message clearer than Morse code even before she spoke. I'm agreeing to conversation. That's all. Lela followed him, her reaction slowed more by the memory of the searing heat in his jade-green eyes when they'd first met hers than by jet lag. A heat fierce enough to spark flames. Relaxing shoulder and neck muscles bunched tight by his shocking scrutiny required conscious effort. She'd never experienced such raw need in a gaze, and the speed with which he dropped his ridiculously long lashes to hide his thoughts told her his reaction disturbed him as much as her. She could almost believe she'd imagined it. An intensity at odds with the firm, dry touch of his hand when he'd taken charge of her luggage. She still hadn't explained her name, Carmen Lela Vella, but she'd used Lela since she was 11 years old. Calling her Carmen made her father's man. His joke about Carmen Miranda, an actress who died decades ago, made him sound more boomer than the mid-30s he looked. Would he have the slightest clue how to relate to teenage runaways? Sophie's run away. Approximately 2.5 days, 57 hours ago, Lela had lost track of minutes. Her motherless niece had run from their home in Sydney to Malta. Without warning. Except Papa had checked Sophie's bank statement and discovered the flight. Papa was within his rights as Sophie's guardian, but how he had known to look on the very day Sophie disappeared? He checked on Sophie's boyfriend's whereabouts, too. Finding Hamish McGregor waiting added to Leila's sense of being disconnected from reality. She'd taken the first available flight out of Sydney. On the first leg of the journey, she'd focused on actions to keep the fear at bay, making lists of everything she needed to do. Then she'd used the brief stopover to call in favors and get the name of an agency that might help her in Malta. With her plans made, the final leg had been filled with apologetic emails to her office and fruitless what-ifs about why Sophie hadn't confided in her, why Sophie had run away with a boyfriend of a few months, leaving no explanation. Pregnant? Leila's heart simply stopped whenever her mind strayed in that direction. Papa had said he'd hire investigators. Lela had asked him to wait, so she hadn't anticipated this booby trap. Hamish McGregor, why does your name seem familiar? She'd pleaded for 48 hours to manage her own search. Significant number considering Sophie had disappeared for 48 hours nearly 6 years ago. Papa's investigator then had had few scruples and zero understanding of the sensitivities in an 11-year-old girl. But like then, Papa wasn't giving her a moment alone in Malta. Why? Another question to add to her list. Lela had one priority: find her niece and discover why she'd run. Her father's emissary placed coffees and a few sachets of sugar on the table. I thought you'd be gone. His presence was a brutal setback, but it didn't excuse her behaving like a bad-tempered shrew. While she mistrusted his intent, it didn't pay to alienate him. He might even be useful to her. Just not tonight. I said I'd wait. Keeping her word was a non-negotiable legacy from her mother, earning her both friends and enemies. Thank you. She picked up the cup and took a sip. A quick coffee, a few questions, and then a blessed escape to her hotel. That helps. Silence, a comfortable bed with a few hours sleep if she was lucky, and she'd face whatever McGregor and Pop had to throw at her. How long have you been on the move? He ripped the top of a sugar sachet open and upended it into his coffee. About 30 hours with stopovers. The deviation to Cyprus was a surprise. He considered her, slowly stirring his coffee, then apparently came to a decision. Why don't you let me take you to the hotel, and we can talk after you've had a few hours rest? He had to be joking. I'm jet lagged, not stupid. I know damn all about you. I don't know exactly what you're doing here, where your hotel is. To be perfectly frank, now that the caffeine is helping me think a little more clearly, I don't want to know. She started to rise. Thanks for the coffee. I've told you my name, the work I do. The illegal movement of minors across borders. That's one of my areas of expertise. His composure added to her unease, making her pause in the act of reaching for her bag. Google me if you want details. I will. Lela tried to disguise her anxiety with a sharp response. What did Papa tell you? What isn't Papa telling me? Dog-tired, she couldn't recall the elusive memory hearing his name triggered. Giovanni Vella's narrow-minded view of the proper role and place of women in his family, coupled with his wealth and power, were an unhealthy mix. Using his influence to get his way was commonplace. Unleashing a fancy lawyer before they had any facts hit a new low, tantamount to Papa declaring his intention to impose his will on her and Sophie. I've been employed to find Sophia Vella. Sophie. Her name is Sophie. The name Lela's sister Mary had listed on her daughter's birth certificate. Damn Papa's pigheadedness. Hamish inclined his head, acknowledging the correction. Why are you here? Have you found her? She asked with the beginnings of relief. Maybe that's why McGregor was at the airport. Not yet. I accepted the job late this afternoon. Then we're starting from the same place. She summoned a polite smile. She couldn't afford to trust him until she understood why Sophie had taken off, along with Papa's role in her departure. Last week, Lela had refused to support Sophie's wish to go to a house party with her boyfriend. It wasn't their first disagreement about boundaries, and Sophie had seemed to accept Lela's decision. I've worked in Malta before. I have extensive contacts who will find her quickly and without fuss. What sort of contacts? Lela had her own, but if he knew people who'd make the search easier, she'd be a fool to ignore them and him. An experienced investigator I've used in the past. His implied leadership role was a forceful reminder he was her father's creature. What's he, I'm assuming your contact is he, doing for you? My investigator is a man, Ms. Vella. He acknowledged her snap of frustration. Although I don't see the relevance of his gender, you're welcome to join me tomorrow morning when I brief him. I don't have a problem with men, Mr. McGregor. I've noticed a lot of them have a particular worldview, approach problems in particular ways. Sniping at Papa's hired help was uncharted territory for Lela, empirical evidence that sleep deprivation muddled your reasoning. That sounds like an insult, he quipped. I find a diversity of views delivers better results. How did I allow myself to be drawn into this ridiculous conversation? Letting prejudice or ego overrule common sense won't find your niece. Damn him for being right. You know nothing about me. Same goes. The challenge in his level voice slowed her down. Papa favored the quick hit of adrenaline that came from winning a fight rather than taking the time to compromise. She vowed to be different, a vow lost in the jet stream to be replaced by anxiety and exhaustion. Right now, a kindergartner stood a better chance of winning a debate with this enigmatic stranger than she did. Making decisions when her brain wasn't functioning would only make matters worse. I'll think about your offer to meet your investigator. Just go away now. Your father has reserved a room for you at the Grand Excelsior Hotel for a week. Lela sank back into her chair. Her last-minute search for hotels had thrown up the Grand Excelsior. Decadent luxury and 180-degree water views were beyond the budget of teenage runaways. So Lela hadn't considered the hotel useful in her search for Sophie and her boyfriend. Now Papa had dealt them and McGregor in. Your hotel? I use it when I'm here, he agreed. Papa's obsession with control would dictate that she would be under the eye of his hatchet men. Or another possibility popped into her head, and she knew she'd guessed right. Papa expected her to dutifully fall in with his plans, to accept his assessment of his granddaughter's best interest, and to help the lawyer. Not this time. There were no answers to be found in the preposterous shamrock green of McGregor's bland gaze. The color alone bewitched, the intelligence and patience adding to his power. Men were not supposed to have green eyes, not unless they came from Iceland. And she was in a bad way when a trivial fact could pop into her mind while she struggled to form whole sentences. International lawyers and five-star hotels. He's pulling out all the stops, she said. It must be love. He raised an eyebrow, seeking information. Or one definition of it. A bribe so you'll work with me? He frowned as if considering the idea. I wouldn't pay to underestimate the hired help's perceptiveness. Hamish McGregor messed with her mind. His red clay hair and few errant freckles were a touch too ordinary to merit the term handsome. His rock-hard, determined jaw gave him a rugged look, and she'd guessed persistence rather than stubbornness provided strength. The kink in his nose suggested he'd been on the losing end of a fight at some point in his career, whereas his broad shoulders and easy carriage made the statement he could defend himself. Not cocky, self-assured, marking another change from Papa's usual selection of goons. Why would Papa need to bribe me? Lela pretended to be puzzled. Emotional blackmail was Papa's preferred strategy. His mouth curved into a warm smile, softening the angles of his face. His eyes crinkled with humor at her question, fascinating lines fanning out from the corners to distract her. Such unusual eyes, with impossibly long lashes, which he used more effectively than a geisha's fan to signal advance and retreat, to tempt sense and sensibility. His smile, those eyes, his sheer persistence were stuck on a loop in her head. Give me time, he said, and I'll work that out. I'd like to make a move. Do you want a lift? You're like one of those all-terrain vehicles, relentlessly rolling over mountains and down ravines. Lela picked up her cup and remembered it was empty and set it down. I need a minute to think. While you're a pushover, he muttered, lifting his gaze to the roof, take all the time you need. McGregor's confidence that he'd get his way was a minor irritation. Papa's reaction if she accepted his hospitality was the larger consideration. The money she'd saved by staying at Papa's expense rather than her own was enough to pay for a youth worker at the foundation she part-funded for a week. Papa knows how to target his incentives. Bankrolling her was also a sign he'd pit his resources against Lela's. No contest there, his resources were greater. She didn't need his offer to bankroll her to understand the risks. Accepting the offer of accommodation wasn't surrender, although Papa might read it as that, giving her a short-term advantage. With Papa, you took any advantage on offer. Stalemate, she murmured, more to herself than the man opposite. I'll accept your offer of a lift after all, Mr. McGregor. How long would it take Papa or his henchmen to figure out that accepting lavish accommodation was at heart her way of saying money wouldn't influence her decisions or determine Sophie's future?